Okay, I want to take a few minutes here to make a distinction between developmental assessment and non-developmental assessment. And let's start out by looking at a couple of video clips, and then I'll come back and try to make a distinction here, a distinction that I consider to be quite important. Now, in making the distinction between developmental and non-developmental assessment, we want to look both at the context in which the data is collected and the kinds of behaviors that the child is allowed to express, and the way the data is analyzed. Now, with reference to the videotapes you just saw, which give you an example of context and the way a child is permitted to behave, which of those tapes do you think would allow us to see what or understand or evaluate what is developmental in the child's behavior, and which of the tapes tend to focus in on non-developmental aspects of behavior? Okay. To me, the videotapes that illustrated a context that allows us to look at development is the one where my two kids were simply playing spontaneously with their superhero toys and vehicles, and the tape where I brought Jordan to a class and demonstrated a little bit how to assess object permanence in a baby. The assessment procedure that seemed to me to be less developmental was the PLS demonstration, administration demonstration I performed with, again, my kid who I coerced into demonstrating for you. Now, why the difference? When we say developmental, what do we mean? When I say non-developmental, what do I mean? Now, nothing is 100% developmental or 100% non-developmental. There's always developmental and non-developmental elements in behavior being demonstrated regardless of the context and regardless of the task. But in some situations you get a clearer view of the developmental status of aspects of a child's behavior. And in other contexts you get a clearer view of things that are not specifically developmental. Of course, I've yet to define developmental and non-developmental, so let me take a shot at it. Now, in fact, if you've had me for language acquisition and in the language disorders course, and perhaps in the earlier lectures in this, the introductory lecture in this course, I brought up the issue of development. And I made a point that's always a focus in any course that I teach. And that is, there's some aspects of behavior are in fact developmental, and by developmental I mean they come from within the child or the individual. They are not learned. In fact, they are imposed on the world as opposed to acquired from the world. Now, they may be imposed and then developed during interaction with the world. For example, as the children interact with their toys, aspects of development are expressed and in fact undergo greater development. But developmental stuff comes from within the child, and I also use the term organization. In all of my courses, we focus in on organization, relationship making, aspects of relationship making, which I claim, with reference to Piaget's work and Chomsky's work and the work of many others, to be basically genetically founded, based on genetics of our species, and again, things that are imposed on the world. On the other hand, there are behaviors that involve acquiring knowledge from the world and expressing that knowledge in appropriate contexts, us to get a clearer view of developmental aspects of behavior, and what kind of context allow us to get a clearer view of non-developmental acquired behaviors. Well, since developmental types of behaviors, which are organizational and relational in nature, since those behaviors come from within the individual, are not acquired from out in the environment, but instead develop in interaction with the environment, but originate in the individual, the kinds of context that allow that to be expressed most clearly so that we can evaluate developmental status is a context in which the child is free to manipulate the environment or interact with the environment in a way that the child controls, so the child can express what's inside of him or her in the most natural way possible and the most generative way, that is, spontaneously and creatively, without being coerced by others. And that could be and the kinds of contexts that you see that support this with reference to children, for children, are play contexts where kids are free to play, or communication contexts where the adult is responsive to the child's intent, spontaneously expressed. Those are the kind of contexts, that is, situations, that allow us to get the clearest picture of developmental aspects of a child's behavior, that is, organizational aspects. On the other hand, non-developmental learned behaviors may be best observed in more adult-directed situations where the adult provides stimuli to children, that is, creates situations that reflect situations in which children learn things, for example, school-like situations, and either directly question children or direct or command children to perform in a particular way. Under direct questioning and direct commanding and imperative interactions, you have a sense of how the child is able to retrieve and express that knowledge that the child has acquired. And that's the clearest, situation under which non-developmental aspects of behavior can be expressed. Now, again, proviso here. Under developmentally optimal situations where development gets expressed, still learning gets expressed. You can't totally separate the two and just plain observe development. For example, in a free play situation, the child will express their knowledge of the uses of objects in their environment when they play with their toys. They'll sweep with a broom if they've seen mommy sweep with the broom, clean plates if they've seen daddy clean plates. In my house, I'm the one who does the cleaning of the plates, etc. You'll see that's learned material. That's not necessarily developmental. That's acquired. On the other hand, on an assessment where the child is expected to identify, say, for example, idioms, the meanings of idioms. Well, they may have learned the specific idioms, but to be able to think metalinguistically so that you actually the child recognizes there's both a literal meaning of something and a figurative meaning, that's developmental, even though the context focuses on something that's acquired and is non-developmental. So it's not, again, possible to cleanly and completely separate both development from non-development in particular contexts. But it is the case that contexts that are manipulable, that allow the individual to express intent and to operate spontaneously and freely, are the ones that you will be able to most clearly assess and observe aspects of development, whereas situations in which the child is provoked to express acquired knowledge, such as school-type situations and more adult-directed situations, are the kinds of contexts in which non-developmental aspects of behavior are observable. Now to analysis. The second aspect of a developmental assessment as compared or contrasted to a non-developmental assessment relates to the way we analyze the data that we've collected in the different contexts that we have discussed. Developmental assessment involves the application of a developmental taxonomy to the analysis of behavior. And the analysis focuses on categories of behavior. It is categorical in nature, categories of behavior. So, what's an example of a developmental assessment data analysis format? Well, I hope you have at the tip of your tongue and on the top of your mind the Lahey or Blumen-Lahey assessment that you have, procedures that you have been practicing in at least language disorders for most of you. For the two of you or three who have joined me in this particular online course, you had me for acquisition and disorders and have been practicing the Blumen-Lahey assessment procedure for a bit of a longer time. In any event, that procedure is a developmental procedure because we apply a taxonomy to the evaluation of the behaviors that we're looking at. What is a taxonomy? In fact, let's use the term developmental taxonomy. Developmental taxonomy. A developmental taxonomy is a set of behavioral categories, and they identify the aspects of behavior that we focus on, the parts of behavior, the types of behavior, and in general terms, categories of behavior that develop naturally in children based on research. Developmental taxonomies are derived from evidence-based research on typical development. So, think of the Lahey format for a second, and if you recall, I hope you do, it is a content form use assessment. And content is described how? Yes, when you evaluate content, you're evaluating content categories of ideas. These are general categories of ideas where specific utterances are classified. They're classified according to the category of idea they reflect. So if the child in your and what you do is transcribe all of the behavior the child expresses freely, the specific behavior, and categorize those behaviors according to developmental structures, which are categories, structures, they represent neurological connections or structures in the child's mind that the child is imposing on the environment when they speak. So what's a content category? Remember, there are things like existence, recurrence, action, locative action, causality. They're temporal, epistemic relationship based. They're all relationship based. And they don't refer to specific statements the child makes. They refer to the category in which the statement this category the statement comes from. or reflects. So, for example, if the child says, that's a cat, that's a dog, that's a pig, the pig jumped, the cat fell down, and the bird flew away, well, the pig, I can't quite remember what I said, but let's presume I said the pig, the cat, the cow, the dog. Those all pattern. They pattern. They're names for things. They're names for objects. And that we therefore, at least I would put them, into content category existence. And that's different from the other utterances, which also pattern. The pig jumped, the cow fell down, the dog flew. I can't remember the last thing I said, but let's take those three. They're not names of objects. What are they? They're actions or locative actions. So they go into an action or locative action category. Now the category action or locative action is general, and the specific behaviors fit into them. It's the general category that we look for, the pattern in the child's behavior. That's the developmental thing, a pattern or category of behavior. That's developmental, categories, patterns of behavior, and developmental taxonomies that come from evidence from research on typical development provide these developmental taxonomies that we can use to evaluate children's behavior. Bloom and Leahy also is not just content, it's form as well. So we have SVC, which is the basic structure of a sentence, a single verb sentence, subject, verb, complement. Or we have conjunction, complementation, and object, and a relative clause type sentences. These are structures. The specific sentence that the child produces, or the utterance, is categorized according to these, again, categories essentially, I'm being a little redundant here, are classified according to these categories of behavior. These categories come from studies of syntax in children. And on Leahy's taxonomy, by the way, they tell you, it explains, it doesn't explain as much as illustrates that there's a developmental sequence in these categories of behavior. So that at earlier phases of development, phase 1 and 2, children use content categories, existence, action, recurrence, disappearance, attribution. Later on, they use state, they go to causal, epistemic, etc. That's by the time they're at phase 5, 6, and 7. So there's a sequence in the appearance of these categories and, of course, of the behaviors that reflect these categories. Now, the specific utterances the child makes, that's a cat, that's a cow, that's the bed, the cow jumped, that is based on learning. And that's not, the utterances themselves go beyond development. They also include things that are not developmental, but that are acquired from the world. But the category of the behavior, which represents, when we identify a category, the pattern in the behavior, is patterns are imposed from inside the child, and they're the things that develop and become more complex as with age and with experience and with development. Those are the things that are developmental, and developmental assessments allow us to describe them. In the area of cognition, I showed you the videotape initially of Jordan in the Little Object Permanence evaluation that I did of him. You remember the videotape all of you saw of the child with Down syndrome when he was clipping together beads. And his experience with beads, which was maybe a non-developmental element, that was observable there. But there was a lot of development in that. Development was able to be evaluated there in that tape, in that sequence as well. And the developmental aspects of that are things like means-end behavior, object permanence. Remember, he dropped the bead and then found it again. His awareness of part-whole relationships. Now, part-whole relationships, object permanence, means-end behavior. Again, those are categories of behavior. They come out of the cognitive literature, the literature of the Piagetian literature. Those are categories of behavior as much as in the language literature, existence, non-existence, action, recurrence, epistemic, etc. are in the area of content. They're categories of behavior, therefore they're developmental things. So the evaluation procedure, the procedure that we use to evaluate, to analyze the data once it's collected, when we're doing a developmental analysis, are categories of behavior that come from developmental research and that we use to classify observed behaviors in children. I'm going to be, by the way, the Leahy model also has categories of use. Now, as it turns out, those of you who have took the online 640 realize, and I was reminded that I never went through the use part of the Leahy analysis, nor did I cover in 640 Westby's play analysis. I don't think I ever went through that systematically. So I'm going to include for you some supplemental lecture material on the use aspect, that is the language function or pragmatics aspect of the Bloom and Leahy format. And I will identify other developmental taxonomies in that area in additional videos that you should look for that I'll be posting shortly. All of those relate to, and the Westby play video as well, all of those relate to developmental assessment. And in a dynamic assessment, you want to get a sense of the individual's, your client's, developmental status in as many areas of language as you can, and also in the maintaining factor areas, that is cognition, sensory, motor, and psychosocial. So we keep in mind we are interested in development. There was a point I was going to make, but I just slipped out of what's left of my mind here. So I'm now going to attempt to address what is, at least from my point of view, non-developmental. Also an important aspect of assessment. Now, what's data analysis from a non-developmental perspective? Well, you saw in the videotape in which I provided, administered to my child a component of the PLS 5, just for demonstration purposes. I asked my child a specific question, and my child responded with a specific response. Now I'm going to look at the analysis, the protocol sheet, and the administrator's manual, and I'm going to give 1 credit for the correct response and 0 credits for the non-correct response. In other words, I'm going to judge that child's performance against a criteria for what's right and wrong. And I stress the words right and wrong, errors, and correct responses. That's what I'm looking at in a non-developmental assessment. Not categories of behavior, types of behavior, regardless of whether I think they're right or wrong. Categories. Rather, whether the behavior is acceptable or not acceptable against a criteria that I establish for what's right and what's wrong. Or if I give you on the midterm, I ask you to define language, and I expect the response, language is a code whereby ideas about the world are represented, etc., etc. If I get that response, I consider that correct. You get your 10 points. If I don't get the response, you lose your 10 points. I judge you as correct or incorrect, not with reference to a category of behavior, but instead a specific behavior evaluated against a criterion for correct or incorrect. That is a non-developmental way to assess behavior. It's not developmental because there's nothing innate, genetically based, or imposed by the child, coming from the child imposed on the world, that's right or wrong. It's not right or wrong. Developmental things are not right or wrong. They are ways of organizing and making relationships. They are judged by others maybe to be acceptable or not acceptable, but they are just categories or types of behavior. Non-developmental things are specific behaviors. They're specific, and they're evaluated with reference to a criterion for what's an acceptable or non-acceptable specific behavior. Thus, the analysis of data can also be developmental or non-developmental, and non-developmental analyses are any analysis of behavior that focuses on the specific behavior and makes a judgment as to whether that behavior is acceptable or non-acceptable, correct or incorrect. There's no such thing as correct or incorrect in the developmental world. There's just strategies or types of behaviors or patterns in behavior. There are patterns. There are types of relationships. Now, they may yield specific behaviors that are acceptable or non-acceptable, right or wrong from the point of view of the examiner or the person who creates the test, but that person would then be operating, that person who makes a judgment whether or not the performance is acceptable or non-acceptable, right or wrong, that person would be judging in a non-developmental way. Therefore, that's non-developmental. Now, am I criticizing that, by the way? Am I taking sides? Am I saying development is more important than non-development? Well, in my heart of hearts, I do tend to side with the developmental component of assessment as critical, perhaps a little more critical than the non-developmental, but quite frankly, and my intent is not to make a judgment, but to promote dynamic assessment and state that there's a value in both developmental and non-developmental assessment. Developmental assessment gives you a sense of what the child is bringing to the speaking or learning situation. Whereas the non-developmental thing gives you insight as to what the child has acquired already. And the specifics of the behavior that has been generated by the developmental framework. So both are important. That's my point. Both are critical. Both are developmental and non-developmental assessment is critical to a dynamic assessment. The one more point I'm going to make, and that is standard norm-referenced assessments in which standard scores are generated. The generation of a standard score is a non-developmental scoring system. It is not developmental, even though it yields grade or age level scores sometimes. It's non-developmental. Developmental scoring involves identifying categories of behavior that's descriptive, way more descriptive, and stages or phases of development, where the child is in a natural sequence that's based on research on typical development. Standard norm reference scoring, the norm reference scoring, based on a mean and a range of scores generated by a particular population with reference to a particular test in which the child was judged as correct or incorrect on a series of items that are imposed upon the child and that do not allow the child to freely expressed behavior. That kind of scoring, the generation of a standard norm reference score, is non-developmental. Stages, phases, and categories, those are developmental.